The unlikely encounter. Jake had always been fascinated by space. Growing up on Earth, he would spend hours staring at the stars, dreaming of far-off worlds and the possibilities that lay beyond. But nothing could have prepared him for the day his life took an unexpected turn, a day that would change everything he thought he knew about the universe. It began like any other quiet evening. Jake was exploring the forest near his home, an escape from his mundane life, when a bright flash lit up the sky. At first, he thought it was just a falling star, but then it grew brighter and brighter, until it was undeniable, something was crashing to Earth. He ran toward the impact site, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The object wasn't just a meteor, it was a ship. A spaceship. A ship that had clearly been damaged, smoke rising from its broken hull as it lay smoldering in the middle of a clearing. Without thinking, Jake rushed toward the wreckage. His mind raced, what if there were survivors? Was this some kind of secret government mission? Or something far more extraordinary? He had no idea, but the curiosity was too overwhelming to ignore. As he approached the wreckage, he noticed movement inside the ship. A faint sound, a voice, weak but unmistakable, echoed from within. Without hesitation, Jake forced open the nearest hatch. The moment the door slid open, he was hit with the smell of burnt metal and a strange, unfamiliar scent that made his heart race. He stumbled inside, scanning the interior with wide eyes. The ship was far from human, strange alien technology lining the walls in ways that defied any engineering he had ever seen. And then he saw her. Curled on the cold floor of the ship's interior, a woman. No, she wasn't a human woman. Her skin shimmered in shades of silver and violet, unlike anything Jake had ever seen. Her features were sharp, almost ethereal, yet there was a strange beauty about her that made his breath catch in his throat. Her long, silken hair floated weightlessly around her, and her eyes, glowing with an otherworldly light, stared at him, confused and fearful. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He had seen alien creatures in movies, in books, but this was real. This was no fiction. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, unsure. The alien woman, Xara, as Jake would soon learn, looked up at him with a mixture of confusion and fear. Her voice was soft, almost melodic, but there was something cold and distant in her eyes, as if she didn't fully understand what was happening. I am fine," she replied, her voice trembling. But it was clear she wasn't fine. Her hand clutched her chest as though she was struggling with something inside, something beyond injury. Jake instinctively reached out, but then pulled back. What was he supposed to do? How could he help her? He didn't even know what kind of being she was. Her appearance was enough to confirm she wasn't human, but the way she looked at him made him feel like an outsider in his own world. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "What are you? Where did you come from?" Xara blinked slowly, her glowing eyes seeming to study him with a level of detachment. I am from the farthest reaches of the galaxy. I am of the Erythian race." Jake stood frozen for a moment, his mind trying to process what he was hearing. A being from another galaxy. A real-life alien. His pulse raced. This was incredible, terrifying, and exhilarating all at once. But then, Xara's words lingered in his mind. "I am of the Erythian race." There was no warmth in her tone. No trace of emotion. Her gaze shifted downward, and she muttered something in a language Jake didn't understand. But he could tell from the way she curled in on herself that she was hurting, physically and emotionally. "Can you help me?" she asked, her voice softer now, tinged with desperation. Jake took a tentative step forward, feeling a strange pull toward her, but he wasn't sure what he could do. She wasn't like anything he had encountered before. He knelt beside her, his eyes scanning her body, trying to assess the situation. She winced when he touched her arm, a quick, sharp movement, and Jake pulled his hand back. "Sorry. What happened to you?" he asked gently. Xara's eyes flickered with something like recognition before she looked away, almost embarrassed. My people, we don't experience injury in the same way. Our bodies regenerate quickly. But, this ship crash, this was unexpected. I don't know how long I've been here. Her voice trailed off, and for the first time, Jake noticed something human, something raw, in her eyes. Fear. It wasn't the fear of physical injury, but something deeper. Something that went beyond just the crash. You're alone? Jake asked, his voice softening. Xara gave a single nod, but it was the way she did it, so distant, so detached, that made Jake realize she wasn't just alone physically. She was emotionally alone too. A deep, almost invisible loneliness that seemed to radiate from her, despite her otherworldly beauty. As Jake helped her to her feet, he felt an odd sense of responsibility wash over him. This alien woman, Xara, was lost. She didn't just need his help to recover from the crash, she needed understanding. Jake was about to ask more questions when Xara took a step back, eyeing him warily. You're a human, aren't you? Jake blinked. Yeah. What's that got to do with anything? She tilted her head, a small spark of curiosity in her glowing eyes. I've heard of humans. You are different. But I don't understand you. Jake didn't know what to say to that. What could he say? How could he explain the complexities of humanity to someone so far removed from Earth's history? To someone who had clearly never seen human emotion in the way he understood it? But he didn't need to answer. There was a quiet moment between them, suspended in time. And in that moment, Jake realized something that made his heart race faster. This woman, this alien, might be more than just a survivor of a crash. She was something else entirely. And somehow, in the vastness of the universe, she had ended up on his doorstep. Xara's eyes locked with his for a brief moment, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke again, her voice almost a whisper, "You will teach me. Teach me about your kind, your pleasures." Jake's mind spun. Pleasures? What was she talking about? But before he could ask, she had already turned away, her mind clearly elsewhere, lost in thoughts that Jake couldn't begin to comprehend. The tension between them thickened. What was happening? Why had she brought up pleasures? And what did she want from him? As the evening wore on, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. He had no idea what Xara's words truly meant or what kind of relationship they were about to form, but one thing was clear, the universe had brought them together for a reason. And he was about to learn just how different his world, and his understanding of intimacy, could become. Suspense. Why did she ask about pleasures? What could an alien woman know about human emotions, and how would that knowledge change both their lives forever? Learning about her past. The next few days felt like a blur to Jake. Every moment he spent with Xara opened up a new mystery, a new layer of confusion. She had somehow become an enigma, beautiful, distant, intelligent, and yet so utterly unfamiliar in her ways. Her race, the Erythians, was completely foreign to him, and every time he tried to understand her, he was left with more questions than answers. Jake had moved her to his house, just outside the small town where he lived. The spaceship wreckage was too dangerous, too public, and he feared anyone else discovering it would bring unwanted attention. But having Xara under his roof was equally unsettling. She didn't seem to care much about human customs. Everything about Earth was strange to her, from the food to the way he spoke, to even the concept of emotions. Yet, she was trying. It was in the late afternoon when Jake sat down with her in the small living room, the golden light filtering through the windows. Xara was seated on the couch across from him, her posture stiff, her eyes scanning the room with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. She had been quiet all day, watching Jake's every move with an intensity that made him feel like he was under some sort of silent observation. He couldn't help but feel like a stranger in his own home. This was not how he imagined meeting an alien from another galaxy. At first, he had thought she might be a threat, or at least something dangerous, but as he spent more time with her, he realized she was just lost. Lost in a universe that she didn't understand, just as much as he didn't understand hers. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Jake broke the quiet. "Xara, can I ask you something?" She turned to face him, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him, her alien features softening. "You may ask. What is intimacy like for your people?" Jake asked cautiously. He had wondered about this ever since she mentioned it the other day, that strange word she'd used, pleasure. Her world seemed so different, and he needed to understand her perspective before he could help her. Xara looked at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't answer right away, her gaze drifting to the window, as if looking for something beyond the glass that wasn't there. Then, she spoke, her voice calm, but with a weight to it. "For my people, intimacy is not about emotion. It is a function. A biological necessity. We do it because we must. It is how we reproduce." Jake was taken aback. He didn't know what he had expected, but this wasn't it. "Wait. You're saying that it's just for reproduction? No feelings involved?" Xara nodded slowly, her eyes distant. "Yes. We do not know love. We do not know pleasure. We simply do what is necessary for survival. It is efficient." Jake blinked, processing the words. He had read about different alien species and their customs, but this was unlike anything he had imagined. To her, intimacy was just a cold, mechanical process. No love, no joy, no connection. That was how her entire race viewed it. His mind raced, what kind of society would develop like that? How could anyone live without the richness of human emotion? Without love? Do you want that?" Jake asked, his voice softer now. He wasn't sure why he asked it, but something in him wanted to know if Xara had ever wanted more. He had to know if there was anything in her that craved the same things humans did, the warmth, the tenderness, the connection. Xara turned her head slightly to meet his gaze. "I do not understand your question. What is wanting?" Jake exhaled sharply. This was harder than he had thought. He was trying to explain something so fundamentally human to someone who had never experienced it. He struggled to find the right words. "What I mean is, do you ever feel the need for something more than just, well, reproduction? Do you ever feel connected to someone?" he asked, trying again. Xara's eyes flickered for a moment, a subtle change that Jake barely noticed. It was as if something deep within her stirred. For a moment, she looked almost vulnerable. "That is not possible," she replied, though her voice lacked the usual certainty it carried. "My people have no such desires. We are programmed to be efficient. Emotion complicates things. It creates weakness." Jake leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together as he tried to understand. "But, what if it doesn't have to be a weakness? What if emotions could make you stronger, not weaker?" Xara remained silent for a long time, her gaze unfocused, lost in thought. Jake watched her closely, wondering if she was processing what he had said, or if she simply didn't care. But then, finally, she spoke again, this time, her tone almost curious. "I do not know," she said softly, almost to herself. "I do not know what it feels like." Jake's heart softened. He had been talking to Xara for days, but this was the first time he truly felt like she was opening up to him. This was the first time she had shown any sign of vulnerability. It was as if she had been locked away inside herself, a prisoner of her own upbringing, unable to understand the concept of true connection. He reached over and placed a hand on the table between them, trying to bridge the gap that had existed between them since their first meeting. "I'll show you," Jake said quietly, his voice full of conviction. I'll show you what it means to feel something more than just efficiency. Xara's eyes locked onto his, the smallest flicker of uncertainty in them. She didn't respond right away, but there was a shift in the air, something unspoken between them. For the first time, Jake felt like they might actually be able to reach each other. But it wouldn't be easy. Her world was so different from his own. Could he really show her the beauty of human connection? Could he change the way she saw the world, and more importantly, the way she viewed intimacy? Suspense. What will happen if Xara begins to feel human emotions? Can Jake help her discover a new perspective on life and intimacy? Or will the barriers between their worlds prove too strong to break? Breaking the ice. The days that followed felt like a slow dance between two completely different worlds. Jake knew he couldn't rush things with Xara. She wasn't like the humans he was used to, and he had to be patient with her, let her come to terms with the emotions she had never understood. But the more time he spent with her, the more Jake could see the cracks in the armor she had built around herself. Every once in a while, he would catch a glimpse of something behind her cold, distant demeanor. A flicker of curiosity, or even, a hint of warmth. It was during one of those quiet evenings when Jake decided to try something different. They had been sitting in silence, Xara observing his every movement, and Jake had been trying to think of something, anything, that might help her see human life the way he did. He was determined to break through her emotional walls, but he needed a way to connect with her on her terms, not just his own. "Do you like food?" Jake asked, his voice breaking the silence. He wasn't sure if this was the right direction, but he figured it was worth a shot. "I mean, do you eat?" Xara turned her head slightly, looking at him with that same, unreadable gaze. "I consume nutrients," she replied, her voice flat. "It is necessary for survival." Jake chuckled, surprised by how literal she was. "Yeah, well, I think most humans would agree that eating is pretty necessary. But we also enjoy it. We eat for pleasure too." Xara raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Pleasure?" Her voice held a note of confusion, as if she was unfamiliar with the concept. Jake's mind raced. He wasn't entirely sure how to explain pleasure to her, especially when it came to something as simple as food, but he had to start somewhere. "Yeah, pleasure. It's like, when you eat something that tastes really good, it makes you feel happy. It's not just about filling your stomach. It's about the experience. Like, sharing a meal with someone can be an enjoyable experience." Xara blinked, her eyes studying him with a strange intensity. "I do not understand. Why would one need enjoyment from something so simple?" Jake smiled. "I guess that's just how humans are. We enjoy the little things. The moments that make us feel good. Like sitting outside and feeling the sun on your face. Or listening to music you love. It's all about finding joy in the present moment, even in the smallest things." Xara remained silent for a long moment, and Jake could see her processing his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer this time. "You speak of things I do not know." "I know," Jake replied, his voice gentle. "But that's why I want to show you. Maybe we can start with something simple. How about you let me make you a meal? It's a small thing, but you might enjoy it. I promise I won't make you eat anything weird." Xara hesitated, clearly unsure, but there was something in her expression, a slight shift, a crack in her walls. That told Jake she was at least considering the idea. After a long pause, she nodded slowly. "Very well. I will try." It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Jake quickly set to work in the kitchen, making something simple but comforting, pasta with a homemade tomato sauce. He knew it wasn't much, but it was familiar and easy. As he worked, he tried to think about what it would take to truly help Xara understand human experiences. It wasn't just about food. It was about connection. It was about showing her that life was more than just function. When he finally placed the plate in front of her, Xara looked at it with skepticism. The pasta was steaming, the rich aroma of the sauce filling the room. Her glowing eyes scanned the dish, and then she glanced up at Jake. "You made this?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Jake smiled. "Yeah. I've been practicing." Xara reached for the fork, her movements hesitant. Jake watched as she lifted a small portion of pasta and brought it to her mouth. She chewed slowly, as though studying every texture, every flavor. Her expression remained neutral, but Jake could see that something was happening. After a long moment, Xara finally spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "It is different. Not like the nutrient paste I consume. It is complex." Jake couldn't help but laugh. "Yeah, I guess complex is one way to put it. But that's the beauty of food, right? It's not just about survival. It's about savoring the experience. Enjoying the little things." Xara took another bite, her gaze drifting to the window. She didn't respond immediately, but Jake could tell she was thinking deeply. As the meal continued, Jake tried to make small talk, asking her about her home planet, her people, anything to keep the conversation going. But Xara remained largely quiet, her attention fully focused on the food in front of her. There was something oddly comforting about that silence. It was as if she was starting to understand, little by little, what it meant to truly experience something. By the time they finished the meal, Xara seemed different. Her walls weren't completely gone, but they had definitely started to crack. She no longer seemed completely detached. In fact, there was a slight softness to her gaze as she looked at Jake, a silent acknowledgement that something had shifted. "That was unexpected," she said after a long pause, her voice now carrying a hint of curiosity. Jake grinned. "Yeah, I'm glad you liked it. See? It's not just about eating. It's about sharing an experience. I hope you understand what I mean now." Xara nodded slowly. "I think I am beginning to understand." Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. Maybe this was the first step. Maybe, just maybe, he could help Xara see that intimacy and connection weren't just about reproduction or survival. There was more to life, more to everything. If you were willing to open yourself up to it. Suspense, could this be the breakthrough Jake had been hoping for? Could Xara truly understand the joy and pleasure humans find in everyday moments? And if she did, what would that mean for the future of their relationship? Would she finally begin to question the rigid beliefs that had shaped her entire existence? The challenge of trust. Jake woke up early the next morning, unable to shake the excitement he felt after last night. Xara's reaction to the meal had been small, but it was significant. She'd shown a level of curiosity about human experiences that he hadn't seen before. There was something about her, something fragile yet incredibly strong, that made him believe she could change. She wasn't just an alien, she was an individual, and that gave him hope. He could hear her moving around downstairs in the living room, the soft sound of her footsteps echoing in the quiet house. She was always awake before him, spending her mornings alone, as though she preferred the solitude. Jake made his way downstairs, still in his pajamas, and found Xara sitting near the window, her glowing eyes gazing out at the vast, green forest that surrounded his house. Her posture was as stiff and guarded as ever, but there was something different about the way she looked at the outside world now. A curiosity, a yearning. Jake had seen it before, and he knew what it meant. "Good morning," Jake said, trying to sound casual, though his heart was racing. He wasn't sure why, but the thought of today, of helping her understand more of human life, felt more important than anything else he had ever done. Xara turned toward him slowly, her expression unreadable. "Good morning," she replied, her voice still detached, but there was a slight warmth in it, a subtle change from the previous days. "I was thinking," Jake began, "maybe today we could do something different. I want to show you something, about trust." Xara's brow furrowed slightly. "Trust? Her tone was skeptical, like she wasn't sure what the word meant, much less how it could relate to her. What is trust? Jake paused. That was the challenge, wasn't it? Explaining something so integral to human connection, something that formed the foundation of everything he did, from his relationships to his very sense of self, to someone who had never known it. Trust is when you believe that someone else will act in your best interest, without causing harm, Jake explained carefully, trying to break it down. It's not just about what they say, but what they do. It's knowing that they won't hurt you, no matter what. Xara's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze focused on him. And you believe that I will trust you? Jake nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure of the answer. He had hoped that their interactions up until now, small moments like sharing food and speaking openly, would build some kind of foundation. But trust was so much deeper than that. It wasn't just words. It wasn't something you could explain, it had to be felt. I want to show you, Xara, Jake said gently. But you have to let me. You have to give me the chance to prove that you can trust me, and that I won't hurt you. Xara looked at him for a long time, her glowing eyes intense. There was something about the way she studied him that made Jake feel like she was trying to understand him on a level he couldn't grasp. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she stood up and nodded slowly. Very well. I will try. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but it was a step forward. A small one, but it was a step. Later that day, Jake led Xara to the edge of the forest behind his house. He had been thinking about what he could do to show her trust in a way that would truly resonate with her. It had to be something that went beyond just words or explanations. It had to be a challenge, something that required her to let go of her fears and allow herself to be vulnerable. Follow me, Jake instructed, leading her down a narrow path that wound through the trees. Xara's footsteps were quiet behind him, and though she was as composed as ever, there was a trace of uncertainty in her movements. She was still hesitant, unsure of what he was about to ask. When they reached a small clearing, Jake turned to face her. I want to show you something that we humans do when we trust each other. It's not just about words. It's about action. Xara looked at him, her expression unreadable, but Jake could see the flicker of curiosity in her eyes. He took a deep breath and then gestured to a large rock sitting in the center of the clearing. It was about 10 feet high, large enough to be intimidating, especially if you had never done anything like this before. I'm going to climb that rock, Jake said, his voice steady. And I want you to watch me. When I reach the top, I'll jump. And I need you to trust that I won't fall. I need you to trust that I'm doing this for you. Xara tilted her head slightly, her gaze flicking between Jake and the rock. She was silent for a moment, her brow furrowed as she seemed to process what he was saying. You will jump? She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. From that height? Jake nodded. Yes. And when I do, I'll need you to catch me. I want to show you that I trust you. Xara's eyes widened for a moment, and then her gaze shifted to the rock again. She seemed to be calculating something, measuring the distance, the risk. There was hesitation in her posture, but it wasn't fear. It was uncertainty, like she didn't know if she could truly trust another person, let alone an alien. But then, something shifted in her expression. Her body relaxed slightly, and she took a step forward, closer to the rock. I will catch you, she said, her voice steady. If you trust me. Jake smiled, a feeling of warmth spreading through him. He knew this wasn't just about the jump. It was about showing Xara that trust could be real. That it wasn't just an abstract idea, it was something you could feel, something that you could experience with someone else. Jake climbed the rock, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the top, he paused for a moment, looking down at Xara below. He could see the slight tension in her posture as she stood ready to catch him, her eyes locked on his. There was a brief moment of doubt, what if she didn't catch him? What if this whole thing was too much for her? But then he took a deep breath, and without looking back, he jumped. For a split second, Jake felt the rush of air, the feeling of falling. And then, before he knew it, Xara's hands were there, catching him firmly. She didn't falter. She didn't hesitate. Jake landed safely in her arms, and for a moment, they both stood still, breathing heavily. The world seemed to pause around them. Xara looked at him, her glowing eyes wide. You trusted me. Jake smiled, his heart racing in his chest. And you caught me. For the first time, there was something more than just duty in Xara's eyes. There was a spark of something human, something that looked like connection, like understanding. It was a start. A small start, but it was enough. Suspense. Had this moment of trust been enough to change the way Xara viewed herself, and the way she saw humans? Could she finally let go of the walls she had built around herself? Or would the next challenge be too great for their newfound bond? Uncovering hidden desires. The next few days felt like a turning point in Jake and Xara's strange relationship. There was a subtle shift in the air between them, a quiet understanding that hadn't existed before. After their trust exercise, something in Xara had changed. She seemed more open, more present. For the first time, she looked at Jake not with the cold detachment she had once shown, but with curiosity and even a hint of appreciation. Jake noticed it the moment he woke up the next morning. Xara was sitting in the kitchen, a cup of something steaming in her hands. It wasn't the first time she had tried food or drinks he had made, but this time, there was an unusual calmness to her. She wasn't just observing, she was participating. Her usual silence had transformed into a soft, gentle presence. "Good morning," Jake said as he entered, trying to keep his voice light and casual. Xara turned toward him, her glowing eyes meeting his. "Good morning, Jake. I was thinking." Jake raised an eyebrow, surprised. It wasn't often that she initiated conversations. "What about?" "I was thinking about what you said, about pleasure. About enjoying things, like food." She paused for a moment, glancing down at the drink in her hands. "I have been wondering if there are other things I might enjoy. Things that aren't about function." Jake's heart skipped a beat. She was asking about pleasure. It was a big leap for her, a sign that maybe, just maybe, the walls around her were crumbling more than he had expected. "What kinds of things?" he asked cautiously, knowing this was a delicate moment. Xara hesitated, her gaze shifting as if she were unsure of how to express herself. "I do not understand what you mean by connection. I understand that food can be enjoyed, that it can be more than just nourishment. But what of touch? Or closeness?" Jake's breath caught in his throat. This was the first time she had brought up anything so intimate. He knew it wasn't just a question of curiosity anymore, there was something deeper at play here. Something that Xara might not even fully understand herself. "You're asking about intimacy," Jake said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. "About physical closeness, right?" Xara nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. "Yes. I feel something when I am near you. It is not discomfort, as I once felt, but something else. Something strange." "Is it pleasure?" Jake could barely contain his surprise. She was asking the very question he had been hoping to hear, but he knew it wasn't something he could rush her into. Xara's understanding of intimacy was entirely different from his own. "It could be," Jake said carefully. "But it's not just about physical closeness. It's about connection. It's about trust and shared experience. And yes, sometimes, it can involve touch. But it's not something you can force. It has to happen naturally. It has to be something you're ready for." Xara's gaze never left his. It was like she was searching him, trying to gauge whether she could trust him with this new and vulnerable part of herself. "I want to understand," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to know what this connection is." Jake felt a surge of both excitement and responsibility. He had wanted to help Xara understand these human emotions, but now, the stakes were higher. She was asking about something deeply personal, something that required a level of care and sensitivity he hadn't expected. He couldn't just jump into this without considering what she needed, or what he needed. "You've already started understanding it," Jake said, trying to reassure her. "It's not about one single moment. It's about opening up to someone, letting them into your life, your thoughts. It's the little things, the way we care for each other, the way we share our experiences. Touch can be a part of it, but so can words, or just being there for each other." Xara was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing his words. Finally, she spoke again, her voice almost hesitant. "So, it is not wrong to want to be closer to you?" Jake's heart pounded. He wasn't sure how to answer this without making her feel confused or pressured. But he knew that if he was going to help Xara understand this human side of herself, he had to be patient, and he had to be gentle. "No, it's not wrong," Jake replied, his voice low and steady. "Wanting closeness isn't wrong. But it's not something you have to force, either. If you feel it, that's okay. You don't have to understand it all at once." Xara nodded slowly, a quiet understanding in her expression. She didn't say anything else, but Jake could see that the conversation had made an impact. She was beginning to understand, and that was more than he could have hoped for. As the days passed, Jake noticed that Xara began to show more interest in human experiences, simple things like touch, laughter, and shared moments. She seemed more comfortable with the idea of connection, though she still wasn't entirely sure what it meant. There were moments when their gazes would lock, and Xara's eyes would soften in a way that made Jake wonder if she was beginning to realize that she was more capable of these feelings than she thought. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Jake reached over and gently touched her hand. He did it without thinking, a simple gesture that was meant to convey comfort, not pressure. To his surprise, Xara didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at their joined hands, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw a flicker of something in her expression, something he couldn't quite place, but it made his heart race. "I feel it now," Xara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The connection. It is different. But it is not unpleasant." Jake smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. She was understanding it. She was beginning to see what he had been trying to show her all along, the beauty of human connection. But just as he was about to speak, Xara pulled her hand back slightly, her eyes distant again. "But I still do not understand why it matters," she said, her voice quiet, almost regretful. "I do not understand why closeness is important if it does not serve a function." Jake sighed, knowing this would be the next hurdle. She was starting to understand the feeling of connection, but understanding its value, its importance, was something entirely different. "It matters because it makes us feel less alone," Jake said softly. "It's not about function, Xara. It's about feeling like you're part of something. It's about knowing that, in a vast, cold universe, you're not the only one. That's what makes it important." Xara's eyes softened, and for a moment, Jake thought she might say something. But instead, she simply nodded, as if taking his words in and trying to make sense of them. Suspense. Could Xara truly grasp the human need for connection, or was she still too bound by the cold efficiency of her own species? Would Jake's patience be enough to show her the deeper meaning of intimacy? Or would she retreat back into the distance she had once built around herself? The test of vulnerability. The tension between Jake and Xara had begun to shift. With every conversation, every quiet moment spent together, they were drawing closer. But just as Xara had begun to understand the concept of connection, something unexpected happened, something that forced both of them to confront the true nature of their bond. It started one evening when Jake returned home from a long day at work. He had been busy with some errands, and when he walked in, he found Xara in the living room, standing rigidly by the window again, her back turned to him. At first, he thought she was simply lost in her thoughts. But then, he noticed something unusual. There were tears, small, shimmering droplets clinging to her cheeks. "Xara?" Jake asked, his voice laced with concern as he stepped closer. She stiffened, not turning to face him. I do not understand," she said, her voice shaky in a way he had never heard before. It was like she was struggling to make sense of something far deeper than just confusion. "There is something wrong with me, isn't there?" Jake's stomach dropped. He could feel the shift in her energy, something inside her had broken open, but she wasn't sure what it was. She had been holding herself together so tightly, so methodically. Now, it was as if the dam was cracking, and the emotions she had been repressing were beginning to spill out. "What are you talking about?" Jake asked, carefully stepping closer. He reached out, but stopped just short of touching her. He had learned to be patient with her, to allow her the space she needed, but now, seeing her in pain, his heart ached. Xara turned slowly, her glowing eyes red-rimmed, and for the first time, Jake saw something in her that had been buried deep within her: vulnerability. "I feel so lost," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know how to exist in this world, in this way. I am not human. And I will never be." Jake's breath caught in his throat. This was more than just confusion, it was a crisis of identity. Xara had never truly accepted herself as she was, and now, she was grappling with her place in the world. Jake had never considered the weight of that until now. To be an alien in a foreign world, with no real connection to anyone or anything, it had to be isolating. And the idea of trying to form human connections on top of that? It must have felt impossible. "You are not alone," Jake said, his voice soft but firm. He took a step closer, carefully reaching out to touch her arm. She flinched but didn't pull away, and that small act of trust was all Jake needed to continue. "I'm here, Xara. I know it's hard. But you don't have to figure it out alone." Xara blinked, her eyes wide, as though the words were too much to process all at once. She opened her mouth to say something but stopped, looking down at her hands, as though she were afraid to voice what she was truly feeling. I am afraid," she admitted quietly. "Afraid that I will hurt you. Afraid that I will never be able to be, like you." Jake took a deep breath, knowing this moment was crucial. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about acceptance. Xara was seeking something deeper than just physical closeness or pleasure. She was asking for permission to be vulnerable, to let go of the walls she had built around herself. "You're already more like us than you think," Jake said gently. "You have the same fears, the same desires. You feel things, don't you? You're not some machine, Xara, you're human in your own way. You just have to believe it." Xara looked at him then, her eyes searching his face for some truth she couldn't quite understand. Her hand reached out hesitantly toward him, as though testing the waters. Jake stayed still, waiting for her to decide. When her fingers brushed against his, Jake felt something shift between them, something fragile but powerful. It wasn't just the physical connection. It was deeper than that. For the first time, Xara seemed to understand that she wasn't just an outsider in this world. She wasn't a distant alien who couldn't belong. She was someone who could feel, who could love, and who could be loved. "I don't know if I can do this," Xara whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can let go of everything I've known." Jake smiled softly, his heart swelling with empathy. "You don't have to let go of everything," he said. "But it's okay to be vulnerable, Xara. It's okay to let someone in." The silence that followed was thick with uncertainty, but it was also filled with something else: hope. Jake could see it in Xara's eyes, the tiniest flicker of something softening. She was starting to let go of her fear, starting to see that there was more to life than simply surviving. There was living. And that was something worth fighting for. Just as Jake was about to say something more, there was a knock at the door, breaking the moment. The sound was jarring, unexpected. Jake turned, his heart racing with a sudden sense of foreboding. He moved to answer the door, only to find a group of unfamiliar figures standing on his porch. They were not human. They were tall, with alien features that seemed almost too perfect, their eyes glowing with a strange intensity. "We are here for her," one of them said, his voice cold and unfeeling. Jake's heart dropped. He didn't need to ask who they were. They were from Xara's world, and they had come to take her away. Xara stood behind Jake, her expression unreadable, but her body tensed. She didn't move forward to greet them. Instead, she looked at Jake, a question in her eyes, one he wasn't sure he could answer. Suspense. Who were these alien visitors, and what did they want with Xara? Was this the moment she would be torn away from the fragile connection she had just begun to embrace? Would Jake be able to protect her, or would he lose her forever? The final choice. The atmosphere around Jake thickened as he stood in the doorway, the alien visitors looming in front of him. His heart raced, and every instinct told him that something terrible was about to unfold. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't prepared for this moment. The idea of Xara being taken away was too much to bear. Xara remained silent behind him, her presence tense, but she didn't speak. Her glowing eyes flicked from Jake to the aliens and back again, the uncertainty in her gaze undeniable. It was clear she had no desire to return to her people, but she was also trapped between two worlds, neither of which fully accepted her. The alien leader, a tall figure with skin that shimmered like liquid metal, stepped forward, his voice cold and emotionless. "Xara, you are summoned to return. Your actions have been inconsistent with the directives of our species. It is time to fulfill your purpose." Jake felt a wave of anger rise within him, but he held it back. He couldn't afford to react impulsively, not now. His mind raced for a solution. "You can't take her," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "She's not your property. She's a person, she's made her choice." The alien leader's gaze hardened, his eyes glowing with an unsettling intensity. "You are interfering in matters beyond your understanding, human. She was never meant to remain here. Her presence was an anomaly. She must return to her duties." Jake's chest tightened with fear, but he stood his ground. "I don't care about her duties," he said, stepping forward. "I care about her." Xara's eyes flickered with something new, something Jake hadn't seen before, resolve. She had spent so long hiding behind the walls of her past, unsure of who she was, of what she could become. But now, for the first time, Jake could see it in her, she had a choice. And it was her choice to make. "Jake," Xara's voice was soft, but it carried a weight that cut through the tension in the air. She stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but steady. "I am not who they think I am. I am not a tool for their purposes. I want to stay." The alien leader's eyes flared with anger. "You cannot choose this. Your existence here is a violation of our laws. You were designed for a purpose, Xara. You cannot escape your nature." But Xara, for the first time, didn't flinch. She stood tall, her back straight, her eyes locking with the alien leaders. "I'm not your creation anymore. I am mine. And I've learned that I can choose who I am. I choose this, I choose my life, my connection with him." Jake could see the raw vulnerability in her, the bravery that had bloomed from deep within her over the course of their time together. She had chosen to embrace her humanity, not as a human in the physical sense, but in the sense of the emotions, desires, and capacity for love and connection that made them all alike. The alien leader's expression twisted, his lips curling in disdain. "You are making a mistake, Xara. You are throwing away everything your species has worked for." But Xara stood firm, her resolve unshaken. I've already thrown away the parts of myself that were never truly mine, she said. And I will not go back. I have found something real here, something you cannot understand. Jake felt his heart swell with pride for her. This was it, this was the moment they would both have to face the consequences of their choices. They couldn't go back to the way things were. Xara had to make the decision to stay, to trust in what they had built together. And Jake had to make the decision to support her, no matter what the cost. The alien leader stared at Xara for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The silence between them felt thick, heavy with the weight of their words. Then, finally, he nodded. Very well. You have made your choice. But know this, Xara, your defiance will have consequences. You will be marked, and your decision will not be taken lightly by the council. Xara didn't respond, but Jake saw the tension in her body ease slightly. She had made her choice, and now, there was no turning back. The aliens turned without another word, their presence still heavy in the air as they left the porch, their figures disappearing into the night. Xara and Jake stood there in the silence, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. Jake turned to face Xara, his chest tight with a mixture of relief and fear. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Xara looked up at him, her glowing eyes steady, no longer filled with uncertainty but with a quiet confidence. I'm sure. I have found something here, Jake. Something that is more than just survival. Something that is worth living for. And I choose to stay. Jake smiled softly, his heart swelling with emotion. You're not alone anymore, he said, his voice thick with meaning. We'll figure this out together. Whatever happens, we'll face it side by side. Xara reached out, her hand brushing against his once more, the connection between them now deeper than ever before. There were no more walls, no more hesitation. She had made her choice, and so had he. As they stood together, in the quiet night, the future seemed uncertain, but it no longer felt frightening. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And for the first time, Jake realized something that had eluded him until now, the true meaning of connection. It wasn't just about shared experiences or even trust. It was about choosing to stand by someone, no matter what. They were ready for whatever came next. Final suspense. Would the alien council truly allow Xara to remain in the human world, or would there be a greater price to pay for her defiance? Would their bond be enough to protect her, or would the forces that sought to control her finally tear them apart?